me just ask you to think about this question. When was the last time that you struggled with knowing God's will for your life? When was the last time that you wrestled with that? And I don't have to ask the question, have you wrestled with God's will? Have you struggled with knowing God's will for your life? Because the fact of the matter is that every single person in this room, somewhere along the way, you've wrestled and struggled with that question, what does God actually want out of me? What does God want me to do with my life? Whether it's a move, whether it's a change of job, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a school that you're going to, whatever it is, there are times in our lives when God's will doesn't seem to be all that clear. And we've all experienced that. But there are other times along the way where God, in some ways, he pulls back the curtain and says, let me make sure that there's no confusion. Let me make sure that you know absolutely crystal clear what it is that I want you to do with your life. So there's no question. I don't want you to be wrestling with this. I want you to know it. And this morning, we're starting a series around something that God has been absolutely crystal clear with us as the church. It's not something we should wrestle with or be confused about. And let me just show it to you. I'm going to put this up on the screen for you. This is Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Right? And here's what God says. Micah 6, this is what he's telling us. He has told you, oh man, what is good. So here's God saying, hey, look, I've told you. I'm not keeping it secret. I'm not keeping it hidden. You shouldn't be confused about this. I've unveiled it. I've pulled back the curtain. He's told you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? That's just another way of saying, what's God's will? And here's what it is. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice. He's told you. He's made it clear to us that as his people, our call, our responsibility in this world is to do justice. We live in a world filled with injustice. We live in a world of isms. We live in a world of racism. We live in a world of sexism. We live in a world of classism. We live in a world where people who have been created as equal in the image of God, who are deserving of honor, respect, and dignity, instead treat each other with dishonor, instead degrade each other. In a world where we ought to be loving and serving one another with a selfless love, instead we abuse and misuse one another for the purposes of our own selfish gain. We live in a world of injustice. And in the middle of all of that, God comes to us and he says this. He says, listen, I'm not interested in you just talking about justice. I'm not interested in you just thinking about justice. I'm not just interested in you encouraging other people to do to go out and be just in their living. Here's what God is saying. He says, I want you as my people to take action. You are not to just talk about it. You're to do justice. And what does that mean? What is justice? Because there's a way that our world defines it, but what we're talking about is biblical justice. And for a moment, I want to try to summarize what justice is because, look, we're going to be each week focusing on a particular place that God is challenging us, calling us to do justice. But before we look at the particular focus this morning, we've got to get this big picture view of what justice is. And this is my definition. So this is what I've come up with in my understanding of what God means in his word when he's talking about justice in the way that we're being challenged to it, right? We're not talking about justice in terms of somebody's broken the law and there's a penalty for that. The justice we're talking about that God's calling us to is a justice of restoration. And here's the definition, is my understanding of this word justice is this. To do justice is to stand with and for those who are being treated unjustly while fighting to fix those injustices as we lead others to live and treat others according to God's design. Right? We're to stand with. In other words, we come alongside of people who are suffering injustice in the world. But we don't just come alongside of them. We stand for them. We stand in defense of them. We stand alongside of them and we stand in defense of them, fighting those injustices and seeking to undo those injustices, to fix the injustices that are happening in our world, in our culture, while we seek to lead others as we ourselves live and treat others according to God's design. And that design is that we've been created in the image of God, and therefore we are equal and are deserving of certain rights that come along with that, certain ways of being treated. That's what it means to do justice. In other words, to do justice, the justice that God calls us to means living a selfless way of life in which we do everything we can to ensure that others are treated well and injustices are fixed. To do justice means that we stand for and protect the vulnerable, including the very young, the very old, the unborn, the terminally ill, the disabled, the poor, and the unpopular. It means treating others as those who are created in the image of God and working to stand for and protect those who are not being treated according to God's design. That's what it means to do justice. And there's two sides to this. On the one hand, we understand that the reason that there is injustice in the world, the deepest root cause of all the injustice in the world, is sin and a broken relationship with God. That's why we live in a world of injustice. Which means we understand that one side of doing justice is that we actually go out and we proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. We tell people the ultimate message of hope, which is that Jesus Christ, God's Son, was sent into this world to seek and save that which is lost. That he came into this world to live the life we couldn't, go to the cross, pay the penalty that we deserved, so that we could believe in him, receive that gift of salvation, be rescued and saved, not on the basis of our works, but on the basis of his finished work. If we're going to do justice, we have to go and proclaim that message, but there's another side to that. It's two sides to the same coin, and the other side of that is that we don't just go proclaiming a message, but we go living that message. And to live that message means that we not only go after the spiritual issues and the spiritual needs, but we go after the physical needs. We go after the emotional needs. We go after relational needs. We go after all of those needs, the mental needs that are going on in our culture in the middle of injustice. We go after both of them. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And it's important for us to clarify that because there are some churches, we'll use that word loosely. There are some churches who would say, no, you know what? We don't actually have to go and tell people about Jesus. We just go and do good things. We go and we take care of the felt needs of people, but we don't proclaim the gospel. And then there's other churches on the other side who go, we don't care about anybody's physical, mental, emotional needs. We're just going to go and tell people about Jesus. And see, the problem with that is, listen, if we go and all we do is take care of the needs on the surface without telling people the gospel, then we put a Band-Aid on the cancer of sin. And though we may deal with the symptom of it temporarily, we never solve it because we never go after the root issue. And when we go and all we do is proclaim the gospel without actually meeting the felt needs of people, then we deny the gospel by our living, the practical implications of the gospel, which is at the very least, not at the very least, at the foundation, is loving others as we've been loved, not with just words, but with our actions. We have been called as the church to do justice. And the first place that we're going to focus our attention is in the area of poverty. Matthew chapter 25, we are getting a glimpse really at the very end of Jesus' primary teaching in the Gospel of Matthew before he goes to the cross. And he's talking about the final judgment. The disciples have asked him, hey, when are you going to set up your kingdom? They're still a bit confused about the whole crucifixion, resurrection thing, even though Jesus has been preparing them. And so Jesus is saying, well, I'm going to set up my kingdom, but it's going to be when I come again. Right? I'm going to go away, but when I return, I'm going to come as conquering king. I will sit on a throne. There will be a judgment, and I'm going to set up my kingdom. And that's really at the heart of what he's talking about. But as he talks about that coming judgment, at the same time, he gives us a glimpse of his heart for those who are suffering in poverty. And he also shows us what our calling is as his people in doing justice in regards to poverty in our world. And that's what we're going to look at together. Would you stand with me? Let's stand in honor of God's word. Let's read it together. Matthew chapter 25, we're going to look at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. You gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is God's word. You can go ahead and be seated. So we're talking about justice in the area of poverty, and there's 4 things that I see in this passage that we really need to understand as we think about what it is that God's calling us to. And here's number 1. God sees, identifies with, and has a plan to provide for those in need. And I know there's a lot just in this one single point, but I want you to track with me on this for just a moment. For the majority of people in our world, poverty is a daily reality. And this is something that is easy for us to forget living kind of cushioned within the suburbs of Chicago. It's easy for us to forget about this. So let me just give you a few statistics to put this into perspective. 50% of our world, that's 3 billion people, live on $2.50 or less a day. 3 billion people. 80% of our world lives on $10 or less a day. That's $300 a month, right? Less than that. $300 or less a month. That 80% of the world's population, they're living in poverty. UNICEF says that every single day, I want you to just stop and think about this for a moment. Every single day, 22,000 children die as a direct result of the poverty in our world. But it's not just a global issue. See, we tend to think of poverty as out there. Right, Sarah and I went on we've supported a number of kids down in Ecuador. In fact, we got to go down to Ecuador to visit one of our kids who was living in a cinder block house with a dirt floor and a metal roof. I mean, so we tend to think of poverty in terms of something like that, but I want you to just hear this. In Illinois, 13% of the people in Illinois are living below the poverty line. In Joliet and Aurora, 2 cities that are basically bordering us, that poverty line is at 12% of the population in both of those cities are living in poverty. In Plainfield, Illinois, there are over 1,200 people who are in complete poverty right now. 1,200 people in our own city who are in poverty. And if you look at those statistics, the majority of those people who are directly affected by that poverty are either children who are very young, or adults over the age of 75. In other words, poverty is mainly affecting those who are powerless to do anything about it. And think about this for a moment. When we're talking poverty, they only use one measurement to actually say what poverty is, and it's salary. How much money do you make? That's the only thing. In fact, I just read an article this week about how they're trying to adjust and figure out another method or other tools that they can use to measure poverty, because poverty isn't just a financial issue. In fact, Jesus shows us in this passage that poverty is a multifaceted problem. Because he isn't just talking about money. He talks about the ability to afford food, the ability to have water to drink, so necessities. He talks about clothes. He talks about community and relationships, the need for belonging. He talks about care. He talks about struggles with your health. See, poverty isn't just a one-dimensional issue. It is a multifaceted issue. And so here's how I'm going to define poverty for us this morning. Because there's really not a great definition out there of poverty that takes all of that into account. Poverty is the inability to consistently provide for your needs and the needs of those who are dependent on you. Poverty is it is the inability to consistently provide for your needs and the needs of those who are dependent on you. It is not just a global problem, it's a local problem, and it's not just a problem that's out there. It's a problem that exists even in our own church. Some of you here this morning, you know exactly what I'm talking about because you are in that place where you have been struggling, or you've struggled in your past, or you're struggling now to make ends meet, to provide for your family, to provide for your own needs, and you've been there, and maybe nobody else is aware of that. Maybe nobody else really knows about that, but you know what that's like, and that's where you find yourself. And I want you to hear this morning. Whether you're here in this room or whether you're listening online, hear this. God sees you, and he has not forgotten you. He sees you, and he has not forgotten you. You and I, we know that when we go through difficulties and when we go through trials and we go through struggles, it is so easy for us when we go through those to begin to feel like God has forgotten us, that God has abandoned us, that God doesn't care about us. But you need to know this morning. If you are a person who struggles with this, that God sees you and he cares for you. And here's how I know that. 2 days, just a few days out from the cross, here's Jesus. And yes, he's talking about when he's coming back, and that he's going to be coming back as conquering king, and there's going to be a judgment. But I want you to hear this. As he is looking towards the cross and he's thinking about the coming judgment, he could have used any illustration, he could have used any tool, but what's he talking about? He's talking about those who are struggling with poverty and how they get provided for. He's aware. He has not forgotten you. And not only has he not forgotten you, but hear this, he understands what you're going through. We have a God who understands what it is to need and to have poverty. And here's why we can say that, is because when Jesus, the Son of God, came and took on flesh and blood, he didn't come in power. He didn't come with money. He didn't come into riches and wealth. He was born in a stable for animals and laid in a trough. When his parents came to have him circumcised at the temple, they brought the offering of 2 pigeons, which, by the way, was the lowest possible offering, the least expensive offering that would only be accepted by those who were absolutely in poverty. So here's Jesus. He's born into poverty. Not only is he born into poverty, when he grows up, he says, foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He knows what it is to walk in this world and to have need. One pastor put it this way. He rode into town on a borrowed donkey. He died and was buried in a borrowed tomb. He ate his last meal in a borrowed room. He was poor. More than that, he became oppressed. He didn't just become poor, he became the victim of injustice. See, God understands what it is to be in need. And hear this, not only does he understand it, but God seeing you, knowing you, remembering you, knowing the struggle, understanding it, has a plan to take care of and meet those needs. And hear this, church. For every single one of us as his people, God's plan to meet the needs of those who are struggling in poverty is through the radical generosity of his people. That has been God's plan throughout all of history. Our call, here's point number 2, our call as Christians is to care for the needs around us with practical provision. That's our call. God's people have always had this call, and we've always had this responsibility. And I know we get to Matthew chapter 25, and our tendency is to, look at the heart of it. Jesus is talking about this final judgment, and as he's talking about it, it creates a theological tension for us. Because as he's explaining this final judgment, it seems like, and people have taken it to mean this, that Jesus is saying the people who get into heaven are those who take care of the poor, and the people who go to hell are those who don't take care of the poor, which makes it sound like that the way you get saved is through works, and we talk about being saved by grace alone and not by works, and so the question is, well, which one is it? And so what we do is we get so focused on the theological debate, and by the way, we'll talk about that in a moment, we miss what Jesus is saying in this moment, and let's just step back for a moment, and let's all acknowledge together that the sheep, those who get sent into eternal life, every single one of them is someone who cares for those who are struggling in poverty. So we can get into the theological debate, or we can step back and go, okay, so God is saying his people are meant to care for those in need. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. And I'll address that theological issue in just a moment. But hear this. God's plan throughout all of history was to provide for those in poverty through the radical generosity of his people. And I could take you to so many places. Let me just take you to a few. Deuteronomy chapter 17, and I'll put some portions of this up on the screen for you, but listen to it. This is Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 7. If among you, this is God talking to his people, Israel. Okay, so we recognize he's talking to Israel, but there's some things that we can take away from this, so just listen. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. But you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake, for there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. I don't think I really need to say too much about this, but let's just a few things. Number one, God says there's always going to be need. There is always, the issue is never a lack of poverty. If we're not dealing with poverty, it's not because there's not a lack of it, it's because we're not seeing it. We're not facing it. There is always need, and there is a risk, and the risk is that we get hard-hearted towards those who are in poverty. We look on them through a lens that is negative and potentially diminishes them as people. We get bad attitudes that say, well, if only you worked hard enough, then maybe you would actually be not in poverty, as if every person in poverty isn't a hard worker. Let's acknowledge for a moment there are some people who are poor because they don't work, but there are some people who are poor, and it's definitely not because they're lazy. They're working their butts off, but they're stuck in that place and situation in life. And there's a danger that we're going to get hard-hearted and hear this. The danger for us is this, that we see the need, we have the means to meet it, and if we don't meet it, what did God say that it was? If we see the need and we don't meet it, what's the ultimate, what does he say? It's sin. James chapter 4, verse 17, if you see the need, you know what you ought to do, and you do not do it. Anyone who knows what they ought to do and doesn't do it, sins. God's plan with Israel. Fast forward to the New Testament. Go one slide back for just a moment. Go one slide back for me, okay? Here's Acts chapter 4. The church is now growing and flourishing. People are being added to their number daily, and it says there was not a needy person among them. That's not because when the church started, it was full of rich people. Like everybody had money in the church, all the poor people were out there. No, the reason that there wasn't anyone who was needy among them was because there were those who had more, who had extra, and when they saw need, they took the extra they had, they sold it, they gave the money to the apostles, laid it at their feet, and then the apostles took that money and distributed it to those who had need so that they eradicated need within their community. God's plan throughout history has been to provide for those in need through the radical generosity of his people. And not just for those who are his people. It's not as if the church only cares for our own and forgets everybody else. That's not the design. And I know the tendency is to maybe even be tempted to look at that. Even as we read Matthew 25, Jesus talks about doing this for the least of these, my brothers. And who are my brothers? Well, of course, that applies to those who are his followers and those who are his people. But it doesn't stop there. It's meant to extend beyond that. And here's how I know that. Isaiah chapter 58. Go to this next slide for me for just a moment. Isaiah 58 is actually a passage that Jesus is building Matthew chapter 25, what he says here in this passage off of. In Isaiah 58, God is addressing Israel who has been fasting, and they've been fasting expecting God to bless them as a result of their fasting. And they're actually ticked off with God because they're going, look at how much we're fasting. Why aren't you blessing us? And God comes back and, he does what God does, and he says, let's adjust your attitude and your perspective for a moment. And he says to them, you don't understand fasting the way that I understand fasting. And here's what he says. He says, is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? In other words, God says, you want to know how to fast? Fast by doing justice. Fast from being passive. Fast from being disengaged from the culture around you. Fast from not caring for the people who are in need around you. If you want to do fasting, fast from that and go do justice. But then he applies it, right? And you see it here up on the screen. He says, is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? And when you see the naked, to cover him and not hide yourself from your own flesh and blood. Now, when you see your own flesh or your own flesh and blood, if you're talking about your flesh and blood, who are you talking about? It's not a trick question. Who are you talking about when you're talking about your flesh and blood? Family, right? Right? Be talking about my wife, my kids, my parents, my siblings, my cousins. That's flesh and blood. It's family. For the Jewish people, if you talk about flesh and blood, they'd be talking about people who are Jewish within their own culture. But here's what's amazing. When God talks about bringing the homeless poor into your house, that word homeless in the Hebrew, it doesn't just apply to literally people who have no homes. It is a word that actually speaks about the alien and the foreigner who is in your land who has nowhere to live. It's someone who's come from another culture, someone who is not Jewish, who has moved in, who has nowhere to go. And here's what God says, that's your flesh and blood. That's who you're supposed to care for. In other words, flesh and blood, family isn't just flesh and blood in terms of my earthly family. It isn't flesh and blood just in terms of my culture. It's flesh and blood in terms of we're humanity together. And so the church has never meant to just be caring for itself. But hear this, if we're not going to care for ourselves, are we really going to care for the world? But as we care for ourselves, we're also supposed to spread out from us to care for the world around us. And that has been the track record of the church throughout history. And I could give you so many examples, but I'll give you just one. In 361 AD, there was an emperor who came to the throne of Rome, of the Roman Empire. His name was Julian. Now, this is after Constantine. This is after Christianity became the religion of the empire. Julian hated Christianity, though, and he deconverted back to paganism, and he wanted to set up the pagan religion back up again to get rid of Christianity, but it wasn't working. And he was really frustrated, and in a letter that he wrote to his pagan high priest, he explained why he believed that Christianity couldn't be stomped out in the Roman Empire. And listen to what he says. He says this: the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. In other words, Christians were doing something that nobody in the culture was doing. They weren't just caring for themselves, they were caring for everybody. And Julian says, you want to know why we've got such a problem with Christians? Is because they're so darn generous. And they're taking care of those who are in poverty. See, that is our call. And not just to care in general. We're not to just say, be well. James talks about it in James chapter 2. He says, what good is it if you see somebody in need who isn't clothed and you go, hey, go and be warm? What good is it to just speak words and not have actions? He's illustrating faith in that moment, but at the same time, he's speaking to the way that we care for people. That when we see a need, even Jesus says, when I was thirsty, you didn't just say, hey, I hope you get some water. What did you do? You gave me water. When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. When I had nowhere to live, you gave me a place to live. In other words, every need is like a lock that has a key, and we as the church are meant to take the key that meets the lock, and we're actually supposed to be meeting needs. And here's the thing. That's our calling, but the motivation, the catalyst, here's point number 3. The catalyst that compels us to meet the needs of those around us is grace. This is what changes us. This is what creates in us to be a community that does justice in the face of poverty. And I know this can be hard to see when we read Matthew 25, because again, it seems to create this tension as if Jesus is saying, the way you get in heaven, you earn it by taking care of poor people. And by the way, there's lots of people out there who believe this. You get into heaven by taking care of poor people, or you go to hell because you didn't take care of poor people. But that's not what Jesus is saying. So let me tell you what this passage is saying, and then I'll dig deeper into it. This passage is showing us that at the heart of Christianity is a relationship with God through Jesus Christ that is expressed in selfless service for others, especially those who are in need. The heart of Christianity is a relationship with God through Jesus that is expressed, it is evidenced, it is shown through selfless, loving service for others, especially those in need. Jesus is not looking at merit. He's not going, you earned it, you go. You didn't earn it, you go. He is looking at evidence, and he's separating sheep from the goats. Have you ever separated sheep from goats? I haven't either. Have you ever seen anybody do it? I haven't either. But here's what I know. It's very hard to distinguish between sheep and goats. It's very difficult, but they're different. But the shepherd is able to look and go, here, I'm looking for the evidence. Are you a goat or are you sheep? And I'm going to look at that evidence and I'm going to separate you based on that. And Jesus says, the evidence that I see that separates you, that shows that you are mine and that you have experienced grace, is that you care for those in need. Just think of it like this. This last week, Sarah went on a trip with William, which, by the way, Will today turns 14. It makes me sick to my stomach. Will, do you want to stand up and have everybody look at you? Or he's very thankful for that. They went on a trip to Washington, D.C. It was his 8th grade trip, so Sarah got to go. I got to stay home with the 3 others. And if I seem like I'm a little bit off this morning, now you know why. I'm still twitching a little bit. No, we had a great time. But one night, I was on the phone with Sarah, and I went up into the younger boys' room. They share a room together, and I looked in their closet. And in their closet, it looked like they had taken out the drawers of their dresser and dumped it all on the floor, and then mixed it together, and then did a little dance on it. That's what it looked like. That's exactly what it looked like. And so I'm pulling the clothes. As I'm talking to Sarah, I'm pulling the clothes out of their closet. And it was a mountain. Out of their closet onto their floor. And it's just this gigantic pile. And I said to him, listen, guys, here's the deal. You're grounded until all these clothes get folded and put away. It's just the way it is. And so I left them. They were going to fold their clothes and put them away. They come down. Now listen, you know how parents pray, I hope you get a child that's just like you? I got children that are just like me. First of all, because I was a messy kid. I mean, I just was sloppy as a kid. Really bad. But then they also got my cleaning abilities now I'm much more clean now. You can ask Sarah. I think I'm more clean now. But they also got my cleaning abilities because Eli comes down and he says, Dad, it's all done. I said, great. Let's go up and take a look. So I go up and I take a look, and it is. All the clothes are off the floor and the drawers are closed. But then I noticed that the hamper bag is like bulging. And I said, let me just ask you a question. Where did you put those clothes? I said, are you telling me you put all of those clothes in the hamper? Like clean and dirty, you put them all in there. Well, not all of them. I said, well, let's just be honest. Like 99% of those are right now in your hamper, and I just took it and I dumped it all back out. And I said, here's the deal. You're going to separate the clean from the unclean. Now, how do you separate the clean from the unclean at that point? We don't even need to talk about that. But that was their job. And what are you doing in that moment? All you're doing is you're looking for evidence. Is it clean or is it unclean? Like unclean clothes aren't going to earn their way into the clean, and clean clothes aren't going to earn their way into the unclean. You're looking for the difference. You're looking for the evidences. In this moment, Jesus is going, here's the evidence. This is how I know sheep from the goats. Did you actually selflessly care for those who are in need? And here's why that's the evidence of having experienced grace, is because grace is the radical generosity of God in the face of the bankruptcy of your sin. And when you know the radical generosity of God, here's what it does. It produces generosity in you. That's just the way that it works. There's no other way around it. Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He's writing to the church in Corinth to raise money he's taking offering for the church in Jerusalem that is going through a massive state. It's in a massive state of poverty. And the church in Corinth has said, hey, we're going to support as well. We're going to care for those people. But they haven't yet followed through. And so Paul's writing to them saying, hey, are you going to follow through? Are you going to give to the church in Jerusalem or not? And then he gives them the motivation. And when he motivates them, he doesn't say, hey, listen, here's why you should give. It's because this is what good Christians do. Good Christians care for people who are poor. He doesn't use pride. And he doesn't use fear. He doesn't go, hey, listen, if you don't give to the poor, if you don't give and help support this, God's going to get you. Or, hey, you're not going to go to heaven. He doesn't use any of that. Instead, here's what he uses. He uses grace. And hear this. He says, 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9, he says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. He says, here's the motivation. This is all I'm going to use with you. You decide what you're going to give. There's people in need. You should give. But let me tell you, you need to think about and decide for your own. Now, let me put it into perspective. You know God's grace. You know the grace of Jesus, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. He says, here's God's grace. God's grace is this, that you and we were bankrupt in our sin, bankrupt to the point that there was nothing that we could do to earn or deserve God's love, acceptance, and forgiveness. Nothing. We had nothing that we could pay to God, nothing that we could give to God. Our only hope was that God would be graciously generous to us, and that's exactly what he did. Jesus Christ, though he was rich in the glory of heaven, though he had the richness of the fellowship with the Father and the Spirit and the glory of heaven with the worship of the angels, though the Son of God existed from eternity without ever having a need that was unmet, as he shared fellowship with the Father and the Spirit, he stepped from all of that into this world, and he embraced our need, not just the needs of physical needs of being hungry and needing a home and shelter and clothes and water. He didn't just embrace those needs, but that when Jesus went to the cross, he embraced the need that came as a result of our sin. He embraced the bankruptcy of our sin, and he paid the penalty of our sin with the richness of his righteousness, so that through his payment, we might be made rich in a relationship with God forever and ever and ever. And when you look at that, when you understand that, when you step back and you realize the only reason that I am a Christian is because of the radical generosity of God, here's what it does. It produces generosity in you. And here's what that means. If there is not generosity in your life, when you look at the bankruptcy of other people, then either one of two things is true. Either you don't know the grace of God, you haven't experienced that grace, or you've forgotten it and you need to be reminded. The grace of God is the catalyst that compels us to meet those needs. God has had a plan all along to care for the needs of those who are in poverty, and his plan is to provide through his people, through the radical generosity of his people, to meet those practical needs of those around us. and compelling us to do that through his radical grace in our lives. We've been called to do justice, and we've been called to do justice in the area of poverty. Let me just give you a few practical things, and then I'm going to close this. Number one, if you're going to actually do this, then you need to create margin in your life. And one of the reasons that we don't do generosity, we don't care for those in need, and again, poverty is bigger than just finances, it's because our wallets and our schedules are too tight. To create margin is about creating space. And some people, we don't have any margin in our wallets because we are living beyond our means and we put ourselves in debt. And the only way that you're going to be ready to meet those needs that God brings to your attention is if you create space. And that means you've got to learn how to live within your means. Some of us, our schedules are so jam-packed that we have no space to care for those who are in need when they come to us. And listen, that's all a choice. It is. And you have to choose to say no to good things so that you can be prepared, you can have space to actually say yes to the best things that God brings into your life. You've got to create margin. Number two, you have to pray. And there's two things that I would encourage you to pray. First of all, pray that God would help you to see those who are in need, not as obstacles that are getting in the way of your life, but as opportunities to grow to become more like Jesus. When God brings need into your life, it's so that you can be Jesus to them and grow to be Jesus, more like Jesus yourself. When you do it to the least of these, Jesus says, so you do it to me. We need a whole new way of looking at those who are in need. And here's the second thing to pray. Pray that God would actually give you the eyes to see the need around you. It's not for a lack of poverty. It's not a lack of need if we're not meeting needs. It's because we have a lack of vision. And if you pray, I promise you, God will bring need into your life. Ask him. Ask him. Number three, support. There's lots of ministries out there that you can be a part of at Grace Point that do that. Our deacons, the deacon fund that we give to every single time we take communion goes to meet needs. And they don't just meet financial needs. They meet emotional needs, mental needs, physical needs. They go and visit the sick. There's a way for you to partner with all of that. We have our partnership with Lincoln Elementary, which goes and ministers to students who are in challenging situations. Our partnership with Green Harvest Food Pantry. Our partnership with Living Alternatives, the Walk for Life that's coming up. Our partnership with Lakewood Nursing Home. All of those are ministries that go to meet people in the context of their poverty. There's ways for you to get involved in that as a part of the church, but don't just treat it impersonally. It's not just, let's go give money to the deacons and move on and we've done our part. No, here's the fourth thing, follow. It's got to be personal, it's relational. And I know one of the challenges that we have when we are dealing with poverty is we ask the question, well, who should I help? Because there's so much need out there, sometimes we're going, well, who do I help, who do I not help? When I was living in downtown Chicago, I used to walk around with money in my wallet all the time. I stopped doing that because I couldn't say no to anybody. And so anytime I was out in the street, somebody would say, well, do you have any money? I was a Christian. I can't go, well, no, I don't have any money. Well, can I have some? Sure, let me give you money. And sometimes we get into this place where we start to get hardened and we go, well, they might take that money and go buy alcohol or drugs or do something else with it. And we start to get hardened in our hearts to the point where we become put off by somebody who's coming and saying, will you help me? How do you know who to help? Let me just, look, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but let me just give you one thought. If God is putting it on your heart to help someone, go and do it. Go and do it. Your job is, you're not responsible for what they're going to do with your generosity. You're responsible for being faithful. And you need to use wisdom, but do not use wisdom as an excuse for being stingy. And then here's the last thing. Share the good news of Jesus Christ as you go. The greatest hope and encouragement that you can give to those who are in the middle of poverty is, yes, your love and care, but more importantly, the love and the care of the God who sent his son Jesus to die on the cross and pay the penalty for their sins. Tell them the good news of Jesus Christ at the same time. Let me leave you with this thought. One of my favorite movies, there's certain movies that I will watch over and over and over again. One of the movies that I watch over and over again is It's a Wonderful Life. Has anybody not seen that movie? Anybody? Okay, okay, everybody with me. Shame. Shame. No, seriously, everybody with me. Shame. No, I'm just kidding. Not really. You should absolutely, maybe arrange a movie night. We'll get our families together. We'll watch it. You should absolutely see it. But in the movie, the main character's name is George Bailey, who runs a company, if you will, a business. It's not really so much a business as much as it is kind of something that cares for those in need called the Building and Loan. And the whole idea of it is that this company is put in place to help those who are in poverty get in their home, to get a home. At the same time, in Bedford Falls, in the city, there's a man by the name of Potter who wants to take advantage of the poor for his own financial gain, and he was doing everything that he can to destroy the building and loan. And at one point in time, it seems like he's going to win. George Bailey is kind of at the end of his rope, and he's considering taking his own life, and he basically is praying, and he says, I wish that I'd never been born. And at that moment, an angel shows up by the name of Clarence. And Clarence gives George the opportunity to see the world as if he'd never been born. And what George sees is a world that is radically different, not for the better, but for the worse. Because he had been there, because he had done justice, because he had served and loved those who were in need, he had changed life after life after life after life. Here's what I want you to think about. What if we weren't here? What if Grace Point Plainfield wasn't here? Well, let's zero it in a little bit further. What if you weren't here? When it comes to doing justice in poverty, what would be different about this world if you weren't here? He has shown you. Oh man. He's shown us what is good, and what does the Lord require of us? But to do justice.